In the lush coastal woods of southeast Texas lies the remnants of a once vast empire. Although Brazosport today is more known for refineries than sugar, 150 years ago this spot hosted some of the most productive sugar plantations in the U.S. Let's dive into the history of the Jackson Plantation, its peak opulence before the Civil War, and the following century of demise. Abner Jackson was a wealthy and connected Southern planter who had been born in Virginia but spent his defining years in South Carolina, where he became an associate of Governor James Hamilton. Hamilton was a staunch anti-abolitionist whose family wealth was tied to the slave-dependent plantation system, and whose political career was built on aggressive and sometimes lethal work against emancipation movements in South Carolina. Hamilton partnered with Jackson on planting efforts in South Carolina before the two ventured on the Retrieve Plantation in 1839. The Retrieve Plantation was located 4 miles north of present-day Lake Jackson, and several years after arriving, Abner Jackson expanded and began constructing a complex of buildings on a then-unnamed Oxbow Lake. Jackson had brick site-made and harvested lumber for construction, utilizing slave labor and the abundance of natural resources on the plantation. Jackson's complex included his grand two-story mansion and accompanying gardens, a sugar mill, and numerous slave cabins and outbuildings. The Jackson Empire would peak just before the Civil War. In 1860, the plantation registered 285 slaves, making Abner Jackson the second largest slave owner in Texas, and it also contained its own recently built steam-powered sugar mill. The 1861 start of the Civil War and death of Abner Jackson the same year began to divulge the long-running issues hiding behind the plantation's stately facade. Abner Jackson had left the estate deeply in debt, and his descendants were fighting for control. Tensions peaked when Abner's sons George and John got into a dispute at the plantation, ending with George fatally killing his brother, a crime for which he was never charged. George would die only 4 years later. With the end of the Civil War and the institution of slavery in the South, the plantation turned to leasing state prisoners for labor, a practice that was common among post-emancipation plantations. Although slavery had ended, working conditions on the plantation were grim. An inspection in 1874 indicated that many prisoners were malnourished and had untreated medical conditions, and one later died while being punished. At the same time, Jackson's descendants were unable to fend off debt holders. At the demand of their creditors, the estate was liquidated in 1873 and divided. The sugar mill and surrounding complex were badly damaged in the 1900 Galveston hurricane, permanently ceasing operation of the mill. The prison labor lease system was ended in 1912, but work continued as the state entered into a sharecropping agreement with the land's then owners. 6 years later, the state bought over 7,000 acres of the former plantation for a state-operated prison farm that continues to this day. The site of the mansion and mill complex, long decrepit and abandoned, were bought by Dow Chemical in 1942 as part of a larger tract for the construction of their master-planned company town, incorporated as Lake Jackson in 1944. The land around the Oxbow Lake was developed into a subdivision in the 80s, and today contains some of the largest and most expensive homes in Lake Jackson. And here, hidden in the woods on the shore of the lake, are the remains of Jackson's once vast empire. The brick footings of the mansion, mill, and several outbuildings remain in crumbles, unearthed in the 90s by local archaeologists. A brick cistern has been largely preserved, located near the barely distinguishable foundation of a large building. These are the last fragments of the empire of Abner Jackson, a descendancy that was as turbulent as it had been grand, and whose fortune is now left to the history books. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel and join me on the next adventure.